the month of October. The Halloween vibes are coming out, even though I live in Australia. It's not autumn right now, it is spring. But nevertheless, I will be continuing this kind of series throughout the month of October. So I will be focusing on more horror genres in the month of October. And so I'm going to start the month off with this video, which is going to be a book review. So as you can tell in the title already, I'll be reviewing I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. This is a book that I read I think last year, and I did have notes on it after I read it. I was going to film a review, but I never got around to it, and so I'm filming it now, and even though it's a year later, it's okay, it's okay. So I guess without further ado, let's talk about this book. So I Am Legend is a science fiction horror classic that was first published in 1954, and it was the book that was so influential in popularizing kind of zombie slash vampire books in like a post-apocalyptic setting. Even iconic horror legends like Stephen King regards Richard Matheson as someone inspirational to his work as a writer. And this is a book that has been adapted a few times during the 60s, the 70s, and also the early 2000s, as we know, of the Will Smith version. The only version that I've personally watched. I do want to check out like the other ones. When I watched it, I was like in high school and I totally didn't know it was based on a book. So I'm sorry, past Carolyn, for being a little bit ignorant about this horror classic. And before I move on to the book itself and why I like it so much and I appreciate why it's such a classic, like a horror classic, I first want to focus on Richard Matheson. So he, I feel like, was pretty ahead of his time. I don't know if he was the first person to write a book like this, but like I said, this book was a very influential book for its time. He published it in the 50s. I'm sure he wasn't the very first person to ever write about zombies and vampires and whatnot, but it definitely had its own style, a very post-apocalyptic setting. It wasn't like an action story, and even though at least the movie that I've seen that was based on this, it had more like action, more intensity. The book, it's more like a somber, slow disintegration into almost madness, but we'll get to that a little later. So Richard Matheson, he not only wrote this book, but he also did a few screenplays for the Twilight Zone, and so I feel like he is quite experienced in this sort of genre, I suppose. I actually didn't know that he did screenplays, but knowing that is very interesting to me because he doesn't just write novels, he does other forms of written work, and so I find that fascinating. And like I said, he's way ahead of his time, and I kind of hope to learn more about this author in the future. I think I should do a little more research on him, but without further ado, we'll get straight into what this book is all about. So this story follows our main protagonist, Robert Neville, who lives in a post-apocalyptic kind of world where he is essentially the last living man on Earth. However, he isn't alone. Every other human has now been turned into vampires. So during the day, Robert is safe. In the daytime, he kind of roams throughout the ruins of civilization, hunting the undead. But when night falls, he barricades himself inside his home and awaits for dawn to arrive. Sounds like a pretty intense but also a very repetitive life. Unlike how it's marketed, this isn't a very traditional vampire story, although it definitely has elements that conform to the classic vampire stereotypes, such as using garlic, crucifixes, and mirrors to repel vampires. They're of course nocturnal creatures and are vulnerable throughout the day. However, it does have more of a scientific approach rather than a supernatural one. The novel does follow Neville's life months and years after the initial virus outbreak. It's an unknown virus that has caused vampirism, and his slow and tedious attempts to research and possibly find a cure for this disease. And as much as this book is dealing with vampires, as they are actually stated in the story, these vampires aren't mindless zombies. They do have some remnants of human intellect that you discover throughout the story, which I wasn't really expecting because I thought that this was straight up vampire zombies when I first went into it. I had no understanding of what the novel was all about because the only adaptation I watched was the movie with Will Smith in it, and so they kind of seemed like they had a little bit of intellect in that movie, but this one, they actually can talk. Some of them, they can actually maintain a conversation, which surprised me. I thought they would be more like creature-like. I felt like this was a very compelling read. It kind of flips the genre on its head a little bit towards the end. Also, by the end of the book, you kind of understand why the title of the book is I Am Legend. It all makes sense. It all falls to place. I totally really didn't expect that perspective. Like I said, I feel like Matheson was so ahead of his time and so unique in the perspective that he decided to follow in the story. It's a very disturbing modern classic, I would say. It's not horror because of like the fact that it's like super violent or like these vampires are rampaging the city or whatever. The horror aspects come with the suffocating isolation that this character feels, the loneliness, the hopelessness of his existence in this world, and that's where the horror elements lie. I love when the horror genre tackles stories in that direction and not like, you know, a gore fest and whatnot. So I really appreciated this approach. And while reading this, because you're following Robert Neville in his day-to-day existence of hunting down like sleeping vampires during the daytime, it's almost disturbing in a way because he is going through people's houses and killing these vampires while they're like vulnerable in their sleep. But at the same time, it's very routine, it's very mundane work for Neville, and he's craving that kind of companionship. It's almost a very depressing read, and like I said, the themes and messages throughout this book is very ahead of its time in terms of that aspect. Robert Neville as a character isn't particularly likable. There are long sort of segments in the story where Robert Neville is relentlessly devoted to figure out a cure, but it's very tedious. He's not like a scientist or anything. So during the day, the time that he has, he goes to the library and tries to do his own research. The monotony of his pursuit to figuring out this mystery behind the virus is just so slow, so tedious, so kind of hopeless and just tiresome as you're reading it. It's just never ending, and it's just such a lonely sort of existence. It's a very tedious and hopeless process, and so he's kind of left spiraling out of control. He turns to alcohol a lot of the nights just to get by the night, because during the day he's free to roam around the city because all the vampires are hidden and sleeping, but during the night they come for him to his house, they taunt him. There's also his neighbor, Ben Cortman, and he was his neighbor slash ex-colleague pre-virus outbreak, and so he was one of the characters that I was a little bit surprised that recognized him, was also one of the vampires that are taunting him, and that was when I was a little bit surprised that the vampires had a bit of human intellect and personality still left. It's almost kind of comical in a way where he's trying to taunt him to get him to come out of his house, and a lot of the vampires around his neighborhood knows that he's living there, and every night in order to kind of block out the sound of the outside noise and not be tempted to go out, he ends up resorting to alcohol and being incredibly drunk throughout the night. And like I said, it's a pretty kind of depressing life that he has, and while I was reading it, I felt very isolated and alone. The way Matheson writes is so engrossing, and you kind of just get wrapped around in the story. It's such an interesting read. I was going through a bit of an emotional roller coaster with this one, which I did not expect. There is this sort of unsettling revelation that Robert concludes to at the end of the book about human nature, about the evolution of man and monster. It's a super interesting read, and I highly recommend it if you haven't picked it up already. It's the perfect read during the month of October, in my opinion. It's such a classic. Please go read it if you haven't already. I'm now going to go into spoilery territory. If you haven't read the book, you can click off now and then read the book and then come and finish off this video, or if you don't care about spoilers, you have been warned. I think there's only like really two things that I wanted to talk about in this book. First off, I was not expecting to come to tears in this book, mainly because of this sequence or moments in the book where it involves a dog, and you know me, or if you don't know me, I get really emotional when animals get involved, and so, oh my gosh, why am I getting teary? There is a moment in the book where there is a dog that suddenly kind of comes into his life, and because Robert Neville is so lonely, he's so happy to see a living creature, another living creature who isn't a vampire, and so it's a very excruciating and long process to get this dog to kind of trust him and come closer to him, and like every day or whatever, I think it's like over a few weeks, it's such a cute relationship that grows, and I was like really living for it. But of course this book decided to rip my heart out. One day you kind of realize that this dog has been hurt, and because this dog doesn't entirely trust this other human being, he always runs away when he tries to get close to the dog, and oh my gosh, I don't really want to say any more, but It's such a tragic situation and I'm getting teary already just thinking about it. I did not expect to shed some tears, but I was crying during that sequence, that moment in the book. Why did they have to involve a dog? I'm so mad about it, but I'm also like, I understand the tragedy of this life that he lives, so I guess it was for a bit of impact, but oh my gosh, I'm like tearing up just thinking about it. I don't know if you guys are going to be more sensitive than I am, but just for warning, there's going to be some tears, some tragedy in this book. Oh my gosh. Heartbreaking. And also what I wanted to dive into is the title. Like I had mentioned, I Am Legend. It all makes sense at the end. So at the end of the book, we come to this realization, this revelation, where we kind of have a self-reflecting moment with our character and we are kind of rethinking the sort of monster dynamic. Because the reason why it's called I Am Legend is because, as it says, he is the legend. Because he's the only human and all these other humans have become vampires, and he's hunting these vampires day after day, killing them in their sleep, almost without remorse anymore. I think in the early stages he was struggling with that. As the months and years go by, it's just kind of a chore for him to do during the day. That aspect is horrific when you think about it, where these creatures are also living creatures. And so Robert Neville becomes kind of like the boogeyman that comes throughout the day to kill them in their most vulnerable state to these vampires. He's the monster, and he's the one that is killing so many people every day, and he's the one that is the legend from their perspective. And that was such a phenomenal and interesting revelation that this book gave me at the end. I was definitely not expecting this perspective change. Also, another thing I don't really understand is why he just continues to have this life, this lonely existence. He can just become one of the other vampires and be done with this life. What's making him continue this lonely, depressing life? I don't understand, but I guess that's the point of the story, because he chooses to remain human. Because there is a few times in the book where he is very tempted to just give in and just become a vampire and just be done with this whole situation, but he doesn't. And then we get that plot twist at the end. So I guess those are kind of my thoughts on this book. I thought that it was both a gritty and harrowing exploration into the sort of mental state of extreme sort of loneliness and isolation, what that does to a person and how that brings about the horror elements. But also I really love the fact that this book decided to kind of evolve the perspective of the monster and the human dynamic. It kind of questions the idea of who is the real monster in this life, in this world, and it was such a fascinating and interesting concept, and I would highly recommend this. It just had all the elements that I really appreciated in a horror. It is a very slow sort of horror, but it is a classic for a reason, and I think that anyone who likes the horror genre should definitely check out this book if you haven't already. But at the same time, I would highly recommend it for people like me. I don't read from the horror genre a lot, if ever. It's a short book, but it takes a lot for you to digest everything you're reading. I appreciated and like sat with every moment that occurred in this book, and so that's why I feel like it had such a lasting impact as a reader for me. And so I'm gonna kick this month off with this book recommendation for you. I would highly recommend you pick up I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. I thought that this was such an interesting read. It's such an iconic book, and I definitely think that it should be on everyone's TBR. I highly recommend it. I'm so glad I read it. I probably will reread this in the future and probably would glean more things out of this book. And so yeah, that is it guys. I hope you guys enjoyed my review and my thoughts on this. If you have read this book and you have some thoughts on it, let me know in the comments down below. We can have a discussion on it. I'm so excited to talk about this book with other people if you guys are interested. If you're not very fond of this book, I'm sorry, but you know, I don't know what to say. Yeah, so that is it for today guys. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you agree or disagree on my thoughts, please let me know in the comments down below, and I hope you guys continue on watching my October videos throughout this month, and I hope you guys enjoy. I will see you in my next video. Bye!